And yet I have also met several people in their 90s of different types who are completely alive as if they were in their 20s again. And so what is it? It's that spirit of remaining open, willingness to try new things. And I have to be frank, like a certain amount of maintenance along the way. I mean, I have told my friends, if I reach this old crotchety age where I'm like resistant to stuff and I feel like I've fallen in a pit, you have permission to sneak into my food or whatever psychedelics. I'm giving you advance permission, right? Just to help me now, because the neural pathways can get really stuck. And so to answer that science part of it, I really think it's like the neural pathways can get really stuck. And does the person have a life that allows them to keep like testing, opening, exploring, expanding, whatever it is?
Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
So this week on the show, we actually want to go to a live presentation we did on the main stage at our most recent profiler training event. We actually had Dr. Dario Nardi come and be part of our event. He actually led a program. You're going to hear me reference it from the stage in the next clip we're going to play. He ran a program called Profiler Training Tools of the Future. And he was running a class while we were teaching the main profiler training students in Profiler Training 101. We're going through the embodiment exercises, helping them understand how to do the methodology we teach of having conversation with someone and arriving at someone's best fit type, but not just to help them understand their type, but how they are their type. So we can offer them help and, further coaching beyond that. It's a very high touch skill that we do. Well, Dr. Nardi was teaching a class called Tools of the Future, which was about EEG brain imaging. He's been on about this in his book, Neuroscience of Personality. He was teaching a group of our advanced students how to actually be EEG practitioners to see what subtypes and what functions and different things that are coming up on the brain imaging and the brain scans. And so he had an entire workshop also combined with artificial intelligence. And so he was there and we invited him to come up to the main stage one of the nights to do a conversation with us talking about one-sidedness, which I think is a really important conversation. And you'll hear us frame it on the stage here in a moment.
Yeah, one could argue that one-sidedness is the birthplace of all of this, since in the book Psychological Types, Carl Jung was effectively attempting to overcome one-sidedness or helping people overcome one-sidedness. And so the phrase gets thrown around a little bit in type communities, not a lot, but a little bit. And in this talk, I asked Dario to define one-sidedness, what Carl Jung's perspective was on it, and then ways to integrate. And one of the things I really liked about this talk was that Dario gives a couple of examples of why it's never too late. There's been a thought in my mind around type development that at a certain point we might hit like an event horizon where it's really difficult for a person to develop beyond that, right? Like there's a point where, maybe you're just too old, or maybe you've just, had so many mental habits cemented that you aren't able to, to figure out how to integrate maybe some of the less developed parts of you. And I found it to be a really encouraging talk because Dario's opinion is no. Right? We never give up on a person effectively. And so I enjoyed being part of it. We took some questions from the audience and I thought it was a great talk, and I'm really glad that we're sharing it on the podcast.
Yeah. And I just want to draw attention. One of our profiler training students, Evan, ISTP, Evan asked a question about how late is too late to make changes? Do we have the ability to change ourselves later in life? Do we get stuck in one-sidedness forever?
Or what does it look like?
Yeah.
What's the usual developmental path?
And Dario even gives a really interesting story about his ISTJ father. And he talks about that, which I think is really illustrative to some of the plasticity and the ability of our personality types to be more rounded even later in life. So it's a wonderful talk. I'm excited for you to hear it because I think it's going to really resonate with you. And also our students ask questions to help calibrate it and make it a really rich conversation. So let's take you right now to the main stage at our profiler training event, hearing from Dr. Dario Nardi about this idea of one-sidedness. So tonight, we're going to talk with Dr. Dario Nardi, author of Neuroscience of Personality, a bunch of other books. He's been on the podcast, and he's been in our community for a long time. He's currently, right now, at Profiler Training, running a workshop called Tools of the Future, where they're hooking up EEG machines, and they're doing brain scans, and they're doing all sorts of cool stuff.
That's not what we're here to talk about, though, necessarily. You shared something with us earlier that I thought was really interesting.
Yeah.
You talked about Carl Jung. So Carl Jung, the originator of psychological types, he wrote the book, Psychological Types. 1923 was the English translation. So at the time of this recording, it was 100 years ago, the English translation came out. 1921, probably German translation, or the German version was there. So we're at a 100-year mark. And you shared this thought with me that after the Myers-Briggs system was created, Jung wanted to go back and re-edit that book and cut out the chapter that talked about personality types. Chapter 10 out of the book.
Yeah, so in psychological types, only one chapter is about the 8 functions. It's chapter 10. And I don't remember the timing exactly of when it was, but he did seriously contemplate removing chapter 10 from the book because, and people ask, well, what should we read? And he's like, well, chapters 2 and 5 is what you're supposed to focus on. Do you know what's in chapters 2 and 5 of psychological types? Does anybody?
Does anybody know?
Ooh, excellent.
One person, 2 people. Fantastic.
Yeah. So it's all about overcoming one-sidedness, that he considered your type to be a problem. On the one hand, it was like an interesting problem to solve. Okay. And on the other hand, he's like, he had clients all the time and they come in and they're one-sided in various ways, not just in terms of type, in many different areas. And he's like, well, how do we overcome one-sidedness? And somehow people began to focus on this idea of 8 types of people and like completely forgot about the one-sidedness part for like a long, long time. And still Steve Myers came along and is like, excuse us. Yeah.
Yeah. So you and I have endless conversations around type development, right? It's always the subject that gets both of our juices going. And you have a phrase you said multiple times on the podcast. We can't talk about type until we talk about development.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So would you be willing to define, because I use the phrase one-sidedness all the time as well. Would you be willing to define what one-sidedness is for maybe somebody who is unfamiliar and then launch into a conversation about why is type and development, why should they be always wrapped together in the same conversation? Like, why can't we separate them? All right. So could you first define one-sidedness?
Sure. Well, my TI is not, it's in my shadow side. So for me, it's like, I think of all the practical things that come with it.
Right.
The one-sidedness, what he saw is that on the one hand, like, I'm going to make an analogy because this is how I work. Right? We have 2 hands and ideally we want to be using them together. You need to open a jar or whatever it is. What if I just decided, okay, I'm just going to use one hand? And it's very useful that most of us have a clear hand preference, right-handed, left-handed, because then we don't have to think about every time I go to pick up a glass, like which hand am I going to use? I mean, maybe sometimes because it's over here, I'm going to use my non-preferred hand. Okay, but what if I didn't have this? What if I just set this aside? So it's one thing to have like a practical preference. It's another thing to have a bias that gets to a point that actually handicaps us. And what he noticed is that when it gets to that point where it's psychologically, we're self-handicapping, we're suppressing what's going on. We're suppressing the potential of the other side actively, that we project that out onto the world. So he talked about one-sidedness in oneself, like in individuals, and in society. Because he wasn't just concerned with individuals. And he's like, all around, people go and project stuff onto other people, onto their society, through the news, through their job, all of these things. And that's a way of trying to manage or deal with the one-sidedness. And it can become very toxic.
Yeah. And the reason why we choose to become one-sided, and by choose, it doesn't always feel like a choice. It just sort of feels like a series of decisions that we've made, right? One of the reasons why we do that is because, well, generally what we're being one-sided around is our dominant or first function, right? What we call the driver function, the car model. That's what we become one-sided around. And very clearly the other side is what we call the inferior function, or in our analogy, the 3-year-old. So it makes sense that we would have a strong preference for that driver or dominant function, right? And because we're just, like you mentioned, we're just more dexterous with it. It just feels better to use. And there's a sense of uncertainty that comes with that 3-year-old or inferior function. And oftentimes we just don't want to feel uncertain, right? We just don't want the uncertainty that comes along with it. But when we go the other direction, what are the benefits of not being one-sided? in your observation, and you don't have to define it, although you did a lovely job and my introverted
thank
thinking
you. Yes,
approves,
yes.
right? What are the benefits of going to the other side? Or like, first of all, in the conversation around type development, why is it that we work so hard to avoid it? Like, why do we stumble into one-sidedness over time?
I think it can happen very naturally. Like there's the demands of the world, demands of our life. And it's very easy for something to just fall to the side. It's like that birthday of some friend we sort of know. And then we're like, oh yeah, I should send a gift or like make a call or see them or something. Oh, didn't they invite me to a party? Oh God, that was last week. To the point where there are people who used to be in your life that you don't remember anymore. So things fall outside of our awareness, and society asks for certain things. Most of you probably feel like, yeah, American society sort of expects like extroverted thinking. You need to step up. Some introverted sensing, like, isn't that what you're supposed to be doing? So I think it's very easy for that to happen. The other is that also that's unpleasant especially as adults, to feel incompetent. How many of you want to be hurt in a relationship? How many of you want to be fired from a job because of incompetence? I mean, we learn from failure, but that's easy to say. Do we actually want to experience it?
Yeah. And so almost by definition, if we choose to put attention to that other side and do what Jung called integrating it, right? Then it means that for a time we're going to have to watch ourselves be incompetent. We're going to have to watch ourselves not really, like, we're used to showing up at our best, and suddenly we're actively choosing to not show up at our best. So what are the advantages to that, though? If we do decide to integrate this part of ourselves that feels weak and doesn't feel as good and means that we're going to fail a lot, why would a person make that choice?
On the one hand, and I'm speaking more from my own personal experience, but I think in general, there's like a peace that comes, like a peace with the psyche. It's really beautiful. There's competence and creativity. There's leadership. There's the ability to both work in and out of organizations. There are really beautiful moments in relationships where we actually encounter the other person as another person. On the other hand, you grow a little bit beyond what society expects, and people are going to be like, what you doing? We don't expect you to be doing that. There's that element of surprise and sort of distancing. You're going to lose friends and colleagues, whatever it is. You will be an outcast if you really grow. Not an outcast all by yourself, but that's the journey then that we make.
So I heard somebody say this recently. Somebody was talking about one of the challenges they have in their life, and this teacher was, working with them, and they said, "Okay, stop for a second," because they were getting really heady and talking about the challenge they were facing. And every time the person that was working with them, coaching them, tried to address the problem, they kept trying to explain it and talk about it. And he finally just said, "Stop." He looked at him and said, "Do you want to understand your problem, or do you want to solve your problem?" And I thought that was it's a very good way to look at how we often use personality type. And we said, Jung said it's a problem to solve, like our type. Me as an ENFP preferences. It's a problem to solve. Like, first of all, I think in the type knowledge, it's like, no, I'm supposed to know who I am to accept myself, accept all the parts of me. Problem to solve. That's almost counter to how we talk about it often. And I also see people in like type world and all these kind of conversations are like, well, maybe if I can just keep understanding, I think the challenge is I just need to understand more, and somehow that's going to unlock something, right? Somehow just understanding is going to do it for me. And often I think that is misguided, because I don't think more understanding necessarily actually does something. So when he says it's a problem to solve, but yet there's this whole system to understand all these parts, like help us reconcile this. Like, let's talk a little bit about how does that unpack this for us.
Yeah, so he advocated a process called active imagination, which we're going to do tomorrow night. Maybe a little bit more intimate terms he would do than we're going to do. But and to give a concrete example, I went out for a drink with a friend, and he's talking about a girlfriend he had in the past that he hadn't actually thought about in 3 or 4 years, and they had a very good relationship, but they had to move away from each other for like work and school, and it sort of petered out and broke off, and then it ended in maybe not so great way. And all of a sudden, just a week before, he had a dream about her. And he began to wonder, like, gosh, what should I do with that? Like, it was a very intense, sort of positive dream. And he was thinking, like, should I call her again? Like, her mother liked me a lot. And when the mother was sort of hinting the last time I saw her, like, go and, call her. And he's like, I do sort of miss our relationship. And he'd been dating some other women, and it was like, I know that they're not the ones for me. And I asked him in the dream, like, what does she symbolize to you? Like, what is the meaning of her? And at first he's like, I'm not quite sure. And then I gave some examples. So now I'm giving him as the example. And he realized after a couple minutes that what she symbolized, what she meant to him was closeness. And that the dream was not all of a sudden a demand like, oh, you need to reinitiate the relationship, call her tonight. Or agonize over some kind of black or white choice to call, to not call. The dream was there, the unconscious was reminding him of something very, very important about relationships for him, which was closeness. And I'm like, whether you call her or not, that's not the point. The point is like, as you go into these different relationships from now on, you're going to have a new set of sort of spectacles on, asking like, what is the potential for closeness?
Yeah. So Jung called type a problem to be solved. And Isabel Briggs-Myers called, she said we end up with type patriotism because there's actually a part of us that should be celebrating our type preferences. And personally, I see it sort of somewhere in between, right? I think there's an appropriateness to understanding our personality type and celebrating how we're pre-wired and accepting that as a part of who we are. And at the same time, it presents a lot of opportunities to get in there and go, okay, but what are the possibilities for it going wrong? So we were having a conversation before at dinner so I did a video with somebody who was interviewing us at our last profiler training event, and I talked about how we should get too pedantic about type. I was like, we get real pedantic about it and we just do all this over defining and get really, really specific. And no, it's actually more like this function's more like this. And I was like, we need to let go of being pedantic and we need to go back to the roots, which is how do we become healthier, psychologically healthier? How do we use this as a part of our hygiene? And somebody made a comment under that video, I've never heard her on a podcast before, but now I know for sure she doesn't use introverted thinking. She has to use extroverted thinking because somebody who uses introverted thinking would never say not be pedantic, right? And I found that to be really interesting because I'm like, no, I know that because I know I have introverted thinking and because I have a tendency to get too pedantic. And once I got pointed out, I was like, oh, I need to stop doing that. Right? I need to stop just being pedantic and defining things endlessly. There's actually an application here. There's a way to use this in a way that beautifies not just my life, but my relationships, right? I can bring it to other people if I'm not being too pedantic. So there's a middle ground here. There's a middle ground between understanding our type preferences and celebrating them and accepting them, but also understanding the pitfalls of some of that. So in your personal journey, what has been some of that for you? Some of that reflected back for you, like some of the beautiful things about having INTJ preferences that you're super happy about, but some of the opportunities for growth and development and some of the limitations that might be woven in as well.
Well, one is my dominant function, and taking until maybe 45 years old to realize that there's a whole other side to my dominant function. Very much like I can do analytic NI, no problem. Have a vision, like extract the relevant concepts, like move in that direction, apply willpower, like no problem. There's this whole other side to it, the oracle rather than the visionary. And I didn't realize, it's like, oh, well, that's actually very accessible to me too. So I feel more whole in my dominant function, that the hero actually leveled up. The other thing is what you said also about both of us have thinking as auxiliary. For me, like, I'm actually very skeptical about thinking as a process. Like when people come out for a reason, like, oh, here are 5 reasons why you should do this. And I'm like, it's very easy to come up with reasons. Like just because you came up with them. Evidence, extroverted thinking likes evidence. In our society, though, almost all evidence is second, third, fourth hand. Almost all of it's manufactured. We don't live in tiny villages anymore where you can go and see what's going on. I'm actually very skeptical of extroverted thinking many times. Does it mean I do it less or something? No, not at all. Every so often, I'm very much reminded your advice is like, no, like step up and do your auxiliary function, like get better at it and to see what are the options with it. Just even, and then I'll be like, oh yeah, actually that is really easy. I solved a problem I agonized with for months in literally like 15 minutes on the internet by simply deciding like, oh, I should do some research. Like other people encounter this problem, like just have problem solving hat on, like what do they do? Yeah, I'm not like other people have this too. I think the third and the fourth function is more challenging. So I enjoyed hearing about the INTJ earlier. And this like, oh yeah, going out in my sweet spot is like once a week or something. Dude, it will get so much easier. Like I can go on 3 dates in one day. I can party like 2 or 3 times a week. Like yes, and it doesn't drain me, just the opposite. Now it does mean having congruence within myself. It does mean hanging out with the right people, you know, finding my family, like that kind of thing. If it's draining, it's not because it's just using your inferior or something like that. It's because it's not you. And what does it mean not you? It's because there's no connection going on there and lack of connection. So I'd say all the time when I look through the functions, introverted feeling, connecting with myself, connecting with the existential human experience, slowly like working through those things and coming to terms with those things. All the time it's like connecting with whatever it is. And I mean connecting not in like an FE way, although it can be that. I just mean like it's the FI part of like connecting to what's important and what is well, where can I connect?
Yeah, I made the assumption you agree with me, but do you think it's more a problem to solve or something to be celebrated?
I think it's both. Yeah, really, I do. Yes. Yeah.
You want to take some questions from the audience? You ready for that? You guys good for that?
Yeah.
Okay. Does somebody have any questions there for Dr. Nardi? I'm going to come back and bring you the mic so we can capture this in audio, if that's all right. Come all the way back here.
La oss
I'll go ahead and hold it.
ta en spørsmåler.
Evan, I'm an ISTP. I don't know if this is asking you to like divine fate or, do a self-fulfilling prophecy, but you've obviously done a lot of scans and research for a lot of older populations as well. So I was wondering if there was any really common developmental patterns outside of, maybe outside of subtype, just in general, any really common developmental patterns that you've seen that you maybe see as possible trajectories. Because personally, I've seen like, the really one-sided older people. And I've also seen those are quite individuated. So is there any patterns you really touch on?
So that's what I was actually just going to say, what you said at the end. I have really been struck as watching people in my parents' generation, aunts and uncles and so on, getting older, boomers, like reaching their 80s, that you never know. Somebody could be doing so amazingly well developmentally at 45 or 55 and like absolutely be stuck in a disastrous psychological space, a pit at 75. Somebody could be stuck in a pit at 75 and seem like they're never going to make it. And then 5 years later, all of a sudden the person completely woke up all over again. So don't give up hope. And I would say a lot of it is, it's sad and amazing to walk into a room filled with a lot of older people, which I have when my aunt and uncle have parties. Many of them have a lot of money and they're successful. They have no reason to grow. I mean, I'm not saying they're not enjoying life or something like that, but to me, they're like, they crystallized. And they're like a character in a painting or something like that. Not to deprecate what happened in their lives before or whatever, but are they open to anything new? No. And yet I have also met several people in their 90s of different types who are completely alive as if they were in their 20s again. And so what is it? It's that spirit of remaining open, willingness to try new things. And I have to be frank, like a certain amount of maintenance along the way. I mean, I have told my friends, if I reach this old crotchety age where I'm like resistant to stuff and I feel like I've fallen in a pit, you have permission to sneak into my food or whatever psychedelics. I'm giving you advance permission, right? Just to help me now, because the neural pathways can get really stuck. And so to answer that science part of it, I really think it's like the neural pathways can get really stuck. And does the person have a life that allows them to keep like testing, opening, exploring, expanding, whatever it is?
Yeah. Somebody else? Questions? Anybody have questions? Right here? Yeah.
I'll hold it.
So just think of what you just said here about openness and willingness to grow, but yet there are some people who are wired to play it safe, don't take risks, don't get outside of your comfort zone.
Mm-hmm.
So those individuals would be less likely to grow if they're like, no, just stick with the tried and proven.
I would say yes, there's definitely that like built-in bias from the start. And we learn that through type. We're going to think like, oh, folks with sensing, judging preference, like they're more, like they're old before their time. They're 25, but they act like they're 75. Okay, I got to tell you, my dad has ISTJ preferences, right? He's 81. He's really had amazing experiences in the past 4 years. Gone from being completely bedridden, unable to move, to like being out and about again, walking up and down the stairs. His second wife died. He has a new girlfriend. He's gone back to university. And he's getting a degree in theology and divinity. Like every month he's volunteered at his retirement center to like give a sermon. Like he's like actually really active, and he is the most popular person. I mean, this is what the nurses tell me. And he's actually really fun for me. I would never have thought when my dad was even like 55, 65, and certainly when I was young, I'm like, this is the stodgiest, boring person in the world. Actually, what a joy to see somebody open up like that. Similarly, his aunt, my great aunt, still alive, 98 years old. She can win at games of lying. Like you go around the table and you have to tell, 3 things, and one of them is a lie, and can people guess and all of that. She's still living life, ISTJ preferences. And yet I know other people with intuiting preferences who have, even at 50, have already completely shriveled up. They're doing the things that meet the intuiting interests on paper. They go to the Renaissance Fair and they watch science fiction and they do this and that, but they have completely closed. And so I do think, yes, there is a certain bias that's there, and yet I've seen so many counter stories to it.
Yeah, I was about to mention that I have somebody very close to me who has INFJ preferences, who is now in their 70s. They have calcified.
Yeah.
Yeah. And was very open when they were young. Mm-hmm. Very open. Taught me to be very open. But just through life choices and circumstances have decided to almost become a cardboard cutout version of themselves. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think type preferences encourage us to do certain behaviors and traits when we're young, but really our choices are so important throughout the course of it.
And that's why I say like I think it's a Jungian concept that when we want to talk about personality, we need to talk about development, because development is a journey, like the hero's journey. Every single type goes through the hero's journey. Every single type encounters the use of all 8 functions. Every single type has the opportunity to engage in alchemy, which is the union of opposites that brings something more than what we started with. So we start in different places, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It doesn't have to.
More questions over here?
Hi, I've just written my first children's book, which is a combination between a choose your own adventure type of story with self-awareness and these frameworks. So Jungian functions and MBTI. I'm just wondering, as a general question, do you have any advice or thoughts around doing type development or self-awareness for children, as well as with the dynamic with their parents as well? And if you see any possible risks, benefits, or just,
Probably not really a specialty with kids, right?
No, it's not. But I know, I mean, there's some general stuff in neuroscience, and my observation, sort of held lightly, is that we sort of go around the type development wheel, the spiral, 2 or 3 times in our life. And one time is that period from like age 2 to 12. That there are so many things that children can pick up which are outside the stereotype. Like I can do surfing and skiing and ice skating and all of these things that I learned as a kid that would actually have been really difficult and I had no interest in by the time I got to say 15 or 18 years old. That I was much more a stereotype of my type at 18 than I was at 8. So I think that whatever happens, a child in a rich environment, that on the one hand, you honor their preferences, and this is this balance, and on the other hand, you expose them to new stuff, knowing that they can soak that up, and then that becomes a resource, that I have these wonderful extroverted sensing resources, that it's not like, oh gosh, like I'm gonna have to learn that now, this like, and whatever it is, like basketball. I'm not wired for that. Like the tactical thinking, and I'm a little bit older, it's not so easy either. But thank goodness I learned these other things before that I can enjoy as extroverted sensing experiences. So I would say that first time around in those formative years is really important. And it did mean also my ESFP stepmother like pushed me at times. You can do it. Things that I would not have done. And my mom is also an intuiting preference like me, would not have pushed me to do. And I'm so thankful in retrospect I got to do those the first time around. And then I think maybe before that, and then certainly over the course of our lives, like we have more awareness when we're older and more choice, but it's also harder to absorb even the activities that encourage the functions. So I feel like your question is very important. And it is relevant, like how do we balance those? And I'm not somebody who works with kids, but I would say that it's a very important question.
Over here.
Thanks. Per Joel and Antonia's rules, I'm Brian, ESTP. As I heard you talk about older people, and at the risk of sounding condescending, which I'm not opposed to doing, as an ESTP, I find it entertaining. It results in interesting interaction. But people who have chosen or have inadvertently become brain dead at the age of 25, 30, no ambition, no interests, and as they move forward through their life, as chronologically it moves forward, do they have anything in common scan-wise, neurochemically, a history of drug abuse, a history of abuse? I mean, do they have a commonality, or is it all over the map?
I think it goes back to the principle of one-sidedness. And certainly if a person is going to suffer something like brain damage from drug abuse, then that really is a serious challenge to overcome. And we're not necessarily going to expect some like magic to happen afterwards, some big magic, some obvious magic. But you know what? I go back to this time when I was in graduate school and we had to volunteer to be part of the psychology club was so popular that we were forced to volunteer to stay in the club. And I volunteered to work at the psychiatric center for the state in New York and at the state developmental center. Developmental center means like, really mentally challenged folks. And I remember seeing a couple there, and they were older than this was in the 90s, and they were thalidomide babies, which you probably know at your age what that means. Yes. And they both had severe mental and physical handicaps. And they were a couple. And you could see the love between them.
Corey, INFP. Did you say it was your dad who overcame the one-sidedness and got off of immobility?
Yeah.
What happened? Was it like after your mom died that he just hit rock bottom and wanted to change his life?
Well, there's a whole funny story around that. So he had reached death's door for a second time. He had already had a heart attack and they had to revive him 5 times. And then like 4 or 5 months later, just before COVID, he was again in the hospital and they literally called us. They told my stepmother, his second wife, and my siblings and so on. It's like, you better come out here to Arkansas because he has 1 night, maybe 2 at the most. And my stepmother was extremely distraught. And she was ESFP preferences. She needed to do something. And so she did. And because the doctors were so very clear about what was going to happen, that she went out and like picked out a coffin for him. I mean, you need to be prepared about these practical things, and it gave her something to do. That afternoon, she died of a sudden heart attack. You're ruining the story. You know what? We actually all went to the mortuary afterwards to see if that was like, maybe we should pick out a coffin that has more feminine, style or whatever. And we realized, no, actually she did pick out the best coffin for the money. Yeah. There was a doctor there, a young doctor who was new. And he said, there's a possibility that your dad was misdiagnosed. So we're going to try steroids instead of what they were doing. They thought it was pneumonia. And he said, if I'm wrong, he's going to die because it's the exact wrong treatment. But he's going to die anyways if I'm wrong. So he turned out he was correct. And my dad had this attitude always that he's like, God can take me at any time. And I'm not going to tell the details of his personal experience that happened in the months before that, but he did have a very NI experience, an encounter with the eighth function. And that's one thing that actually brings us together very closely now, is that he understands and I understand, like we both know NI. And that actually gave me permission to like have that SI bond even more. But he had this like, I could go tomorrow, but in the meantime, I can live the best life I can. Now, was my stepmother an impediment to maybe that growth? But it's not for me to judge. But I would say that he really blossomed after that. And sometimes, we like to think we're going to give it our all for relationships. And sometimes exiting a relationship can be incredibly difficult and powerful. Having a near-death experience. So this is an interesting statistic that Nicole Gruel, who's a PhD, she's in Australia, but she's part of the type community. And she did her work on near-death experiences. And then eventually she's like, oh no, there's a variety of things that are not just specifically near-death, but are like transcendent experiences. What percentage of the American, or I actually should say English-speaking population, do you think has had a non-ordinary transcendent experience? The spiritual experience, near-death experience, whatever it is. What percentage do you think? Like 5%, 2%? Is it only for introverted intuiting types? Like, is it like 50%? Like, what is it? Any guesses? So what percentage of people, have had non-ordinary transcendent experiences, like a clear-on spiritual experience, near-death experience, like there's a variety of things, but near-death is like a great example. Yeah.
We've got a guess of 14.
Yeah.
What was your guess? Less than 1.
Yeah. So the Prue said 40. Yeah, it's 45%. Yeah. And yet almost no one ever talks about it. And that was 45% across age groups, of adults. No one talks about it. So I think that there are so many opportunities in life to have like divine intervention in a way, even if it's a very unpleasant experience, to be that powerful reset that says like, like, why are you alive on the earth? This is like a gift to be here. What are you going to do with it?
Wow. Okay, we got a question over here.
I'm curious, you mentioned that despite being introverted, that now you're going out multiple times a week and having these interactions, and it's actually energizing and not draining.
Yeah.
Can you share any secrets or leverage points on how you figured out how to do that? What worked?
I would say it's a lot of FI and SE. So my opposite type, not in terms of the activity, but like the real FI. The FI, not just of like, oh, like I have a conviction about something. It's the FI of like knowing who I am and knowing what's important. And the number of things that are important are like countable on one hand. And as long as I engage in activities that fit with that, which is I understand from my ISFP friends, like, why is it ISFPs are like so hesitant to do a lot of different things? Because they stick to the stuff that fits with who they believe that they are. Now, could they be also very disconnected from who they really are? Yes. But I would say that's really powerful. And then things like, paying attention to my health and body maintenance and that kind of thing. I'm not going to stay up all night long 3 nights in a row. That's crazy. But I really think it's about knowing and living from who you are, which is the part that says like celebrate your type, but also celebrate your whole type.
Dario, playing off of what you'd said earlier, one time you joked about it and the psychedelics, you said, hey, come, you come to my fridge or whatever. And then you're talking about 45% of the populations had these non-ordinary life experiences. And with psychedelics, you can be self-induced to create mystical experiences. There's a lot of popularity going on around that topic. And a lot of credible people who have used for years, and I'm not seeing them going brain dead because of it, despite the war on drugs and the fear mongering that went on through the 70s and 80s on that. What do you have to say about that as a method of expanding neuroplasticity and psychological development?
So I think maybe in terms of like the establishment coming to terms with the books like Michael Pollan's book, like The Body Keeps the Score, like that, like trying to understand what's going on, that our nervous system is more than our brain, that 80% of the signals in our body, the nervous system signals go up from the body into the brain, not the other way around. To being aware that there's a whole person. If any practice, and any practice can be abused, by the way, there are lots of people who go to yoga and they go to yoga for 30 years and don't learn anything beyond like how to hold the poses. And then there are people who do psychedelics and they party and this and that becomes a lifestyle that they get lost in. So I'd say any practice that's done with intention, that practice, whether it's meditation, whether it is prayer, whether it is psychedelics, whether it is some sport that the person commits themselves to, I think as long as it's body, mind in some way, and heart, like it includes the whole person, that has the capacity to keep opening up the person and keeping them aware. I think probably the biggest thing is the movement of baggage. All of us carry baggage, generational baggage, personal baggage, the baggage that we get because what do they say when you marry someone, you marry their whole family? Yeah, you marry their lineage too. To be aware of that baggage, and if there's any way to lighten that load, that doesn't mean you completely get rid of it and abandon it, but is there any way to make the best of it and let go of the things that do not serve, not just us, but allow us to be contributors, then I think that's great. And it really needs to be the whole person involved with it. I mean, nothing annoys me more than to read a 10-page paper from a Jungian analyst that's just all like mental masturbation, excuse me. But I'm like, you've just completely missed the point. And then I would be like, you need a jug of ayahuasca. But I think there's lots of different experiences and practices that people can do. And some of what the beauty of life is that I could say, I use these practices, you should do them too. But actually, I think a lot of the journey is discovering what practice works for us. There was a time when I was exposed to yoga, and I'm like, I hate yoga. Yoga is stupid. And it's just miserable, and all the stretching and like all of this stuff. Like it was actually the wrong kind of yoga for me, and I was in the wrong time of my life. So I think it's really like that awareness. And, some of it is also, there's a spiral down and people get stuck. And then maybe they're lucky to have people in their life that will help them out. And then people can also, by creating a life and creating people around it, helping to create lives, people around them, it's easier to stay open too. I mean, friendships can be a really powerful way to stay open.
I know we're complete with this portion, but before we end this, I do want to make one note of part of the conversation we had before, which is about bypassing.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Because I think what you just said really, like it's a great on-ramp to that concept of bypassing, which is, this is what's worked for me, you should do it too. And I think what we end up doing a lot of times is modeling somebody who something has worked for them, and we put some time and effort into it, whether or not it's the right thing for us. And then we get the lingo down and we get the language down and we have all of the markers of doing this growth work that's right for us, but we're actually not moving the needle, right? And it ends up being sort of a bypass. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. A story comes to mind. It's an ENTJ that I know. He's in his mid-30s. He talks a lot about this amazing, actually psychedelic experience he had when he was 13 years old. And he's been living off of that ever since. And clearly he has become frozen in a number of ways. And that story, while it was very impactful at the time, actually was probably too much for someone of that age. But it becomes a story that he tells himself in order to maintain. The ego loves to incorporate everything that's weird and that didn't fit to make it fit. And I see that so often. I myself need to be reminded of that. Like that is just like, it becomes too easy to talk a certain way, to tell a certain story. Or as my ISFP, one of my good friends says, he says, anything that comes after the phrase I am is like, stop. You can say I am doing, I have been doing, I act as, I'm helping out with, but there is no I am afterward, to say something. I am a scientist. I am a published author. It's like, that's all ego. And I found that that's a really powerful like FI principle, but I think it can be a TI principle too. It's a philosophical principle to live by. Otherwise, yeah, it's very easy to do stuff that's spiritual bypass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I think type, because it is such a powerful tool, can end up becoming a spiritual bypass, right? Understanding it, trying to understand all the intricacies of who we are, defining the problem, not solving the problem, right?
And in fact, I got to say something, because it's now it is 30 years, I think like last month, that I was introduced to type. And right away, both the people who knew me and I myself, like, oh yeah, INTJ. Throughout all the things that have happened in my life, it is the one thing that I can count on. I am INTJ, preferences. And that has become like the tree, that I can hang on to. And there is this little voice that's like, are you willing to let go of that? Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about some of you here at Profile Training. Dr. Nardi just wrote 2 books. Some of you pre-ordered this, so they're actually going to be available in the back. We just had the shipment come in. So these are fresh off the press. And I'm guessing you would sign some if people want to have.
Well, those who pre-ordered, yes, I'm assuming they pre-ordered to get them signed, and we said
supposedly.
we would.
You don't have to have a sign, but he'll be back there signed if you'd like him to. And I think we might have a couple extra copies if somebody else wants to pick one up. You didn't pre-order it. Probably very limited availability. But just let's quickly talk about these. One is Decode Your Personality, Go Beyond Myers-Briggs, 64 Brain-Based Subtypes. What's this about?
Well, yes, it's about the subtypes. That's a practical thing. Each chapter, though, of the 16 types starts with like paths. So that there are multiple ways, talking about that question, Evan, that you asked earlier, like what are these paths of development that are typical? Sort of covering the first 4 functions and like what that looks like for each type, including some conversations with each type and so on. Also talking about analytic, holistic, and like all those things have been the last 3 years, or essentially in that. I think it's a great book for people who are not ready to tackle the magic diamond, but like have already learned their type. And that's a nice, yes, that's what that is.
And then the other book is Teaching Tales for the 16 Personality Types.
Yes. I was inspired by Milton Erickson and the idea of therapeutic metaphor, and through storytelling and it was actually, got started when I went to London. And I started, like the British have like such an amazing tradition of reading and literature. And I thought, you know what, I should watch some movies, not read books. I should watch some movies that are biopics of famous British authors. And I really enjoyed them. Really, really like 18th, 19th century, like Mary Shelley and Frankenstein and all of this. And I thought, you know what, I've written short stories. You let me write a few short stories and type stories. And then I realized like, wow, first of all, the NFs I knew, especially the INFP I was staying with, is like, oh, these are so much better than type descriptions. Like for him as an INFP, he's like, these are so much easier for me to remember and to relate to. So that like gave me some inspiration to keep going. But really, each of the 39 stories, because we have 2 for each type plus a few extras, are, yes, trying to illustrate specific examples of type dynamics and type development. And we talk about the development piece. Every character faces a challenge and a choice, and then consequences of that within the context of their lives and their type. And these are short stories. They're just like 5 minutes each to read. But they went through like 2 different writing groups of type-aware people and like all of this stuff. And it was a joy to write them, to really like get under the hood, especially there are some types and some versions of some types. I want to say that there are some versions of some types that are challenging for me, and to really find like, what is the humanity and the motivation behind it, as well as them being examples for every person that are like, oh yeah, I'm not like this person or that person. So you have ESTP preferences. You're not like, I'm not like either of these two ESTPs exactly, but they are examples that show type dynamics coming out. What does it mean to encounter the opposite? And then how do we do? Because in every one of them encounters something from the opposite or from the shadow.
Yeah. So tomorrow night, Dr. Nardi is going to lead us through active imagination. I'd love everybody to be here for that. I think it's going to be a very unique experience if you have not been through that. Even if you have been through it, I think it'll still be an awesome experience for you. So make sure you're coming back tomorrow night for that. And then I'm hoping you're catching a vision for just how much application, how much we can use these things, not just to describe and define, which is what you end up doing on the internet, because it's a limitation of the medium. But when we gather in person like this and you start seeing narrative application, you start seeing us talk a little about growth and development and all the different ways this can be woven into the fabric of our lives. Hope you're getting inspired. Maybe there's something you're catching a vision for in your life. Something maybe you're like, man, I would love to apply this toward writing for children, or maybe you're going to want to actually administer or be a practitioner for brain imaging and learn how that can help further the development of type. And again, we want to try to seed this idea that anytime we're talking about personality types, we're weaving it with the narrative of development. It's all about developing on a timeline of our lives and applying it in a real way to make it come alive.
And just to call back to something you said before, referencing Jung's statement that when we become one-sided, it doesn't just play out in our personal lives. It plays out in, he said, I believe his words were, in the political landscape.
Yeah, which includes society, community, family, like all of our social circles. Yes.
So if we can model what it looks like to not be one-sided, if we can model what it looks like to integrate the other side and be willing to see the whole personality, well, first of all, we don't bring so much of that projection onto others in the political landscape. But when we model it, we inspire other people to be open. And then maybe our political landscape can settle down a little bit, right? Maybe not be so agitated, maybe not be so projection oriented. So it's not just in our own personal lives that we benefit. All of society benefits when we seek the other side, when we integrate more of who we are and truly find that authentic core. So it's a real pleasure to always have you on stage to talk about this.
Yeah, it's a pleasure as well.
Yeah, let's give him a hand, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so that was us on the main stage at our most recent profiler training event. Now, if you want to be a part of one of these live events, we often do live podcasts. We obviously do profiler training currently right now 2 times a year at the time of this recording. We also have our personality life path mentorship program. If you can get yourself into any one of these programs or other mentorships or anything we're doing live, like our Quest program, anything you can do with a live touch point, it's really powerful because these moments are emergent in those programs. You come to PLP, Personality Life Path, let's just say that. We often will do live podcasts one of the evenings of that, or a live event, or live speakers, guest speakers during those programs when you're there in the audience. So it's really cool. The profiler training students that were in that audience, this is a bonus. This was in addition to the training they're actually happening. We're able to be part of these conversations around growth, around development, one-sidedness. So I just want to encourage you again, anytime we're offering a program to enroll in, you need to tune into this. This is where you get the good stuff. This is where you can really start to unlock things for yourself in your journey. What did you take away from some of the talk that we just saw, Antonia? Maybe there's a couple key things you want people to reflect on.
Again, just like we mentioned at the very beginning, this concept of one-sidedness and what it really means, how Carl Jung thought of type as a problem to be solved, but like Isabel Briggs Myers thought it was something to be celebrated. Yeah. And it's a little of both, right? Like it's both something that we want to create some type patriotism around so that we can, with modesty, understand all of the gifts that we bring to the world. But we also have to understand that in that old phrase, what crosses supports us and what supports us crosses us, meaning that all of the great things that come along with our personality type also come along, there's some limitations that are woven in. It's like the cost of specialization, right? So having a balanced perspective on how we experience our best fit type preferences, I think, is a big part of development. And as usual, and I love that Dario always says this, you can't talk about personality without talking about development.
Yeah.
So development is the aspect that takes it beyond conversation, takes it beyond, simply just ruminating on the topic, but it helps it come alive in our lives. And I think when we stop simply thinking about and talking about type, and we start living it and implementing the power of the system that is the thing that seduced us all to begin with, I think that we're attracted to this tool because we can feel its power. We know there's something here. If we don't ever implement the power of the system, though, we get caught in this hamster wheel churn of just ideating, and we'll never get the real meat out of the system. And we don't honor the originator. We don't honor Jung, who worried that turning his concepts into a typology system would actually discourage people from doing true introspection and analysis and the development that is woven into a lot of his model.
Yeah.
So I think making sure that we keep our finger on the pulse of that aspect of type, that it's not just an intellectual curiosity. It's not just catharsis of self-understanding. It's a powerful tool that helps us develop and make better choices throughout our lives, to become more complete people, to find our whole selves. That's what's on the table. We just have to make sure that we're not leaving it on the table by keeping it in the realm of theory.
Yeah. So I think, if you're like listening along, maybe you're starting out new, one of the first places we could direct you to is if you have your owner's manual for your personality type from Personality Hacker, you're going to have a car model diagram of how your cognition is laid out. Your driver, your co-pilot, your 10-year-old, your 3-year-old. We really want to encourage people to live from the front seat of their life, from those two, driver and co-pilot, or what's considered technically a dominant or auxiliary cognitive function for your personality. Again, you can go over to our website, get a test, get the owner's manual for your personality type, and understand what this means for you. And then not just from the front seat, but I'd also say that co-pilot or auxiliary process. And we talked about it in the video. I think Dario mentioned it. We unpacked that. That's really where you can focus first, often when you're starting on this journey. So if you have the owner's manual for your type and you look at the car model, the co-pilot or auxiliary would be where we can focus on. And again, in the owner's manual, we've got a lot of recommendations on what specifically you can do to grow that part of yourself, depending on how you're uniquely wired.
Yeah.
So that's one step of action you can take in your life. Also, another action, you've been part of this conversation. You've not been part of this dynamic with myself and Antonia with a microphone, but we do want to hear from you. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Below this episode, leave a comment, ask a question. More importantly, share your story. What's coming up for you? Do you feel like you have a pathway of not becoming one-sided in your life? Do you have a plan for that? Have you worked on your co-pilot or auxiliary? Do you have a story about that? Is this something you're awakened to? Like, oh, wow, I need to get on that. We want to hear where you're at in your life. Again, come over to personalityhacker.com and make your voice heard.
Yeah, and if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. If you leave us a rating and review on iTunes, it helps us out a lot. You might have watched us on YouTube because we have a video podcast. I guess it's been over a year now, so I can stop saying it as if it's a new thing.
Yeah.
Like, subscribe, and hit the little bell to let you know when future episodes come out. And you can also leave a comment under this video podcast. We have a book. It's called Personality Hacker. You can get it at all major book retailers. And like Joel mentioned, grab a copy of your owner's manual. There is so much content in there. It's a labor of love. We worked for years on it. And each owner's manual has type-specific recommendations, not to just understand yourself, but to find wholeness of self.
Yeah.
To, as Joel mentioned, develop the co-pilot function, but also be aware of the importance of your 10-year-old and your 3-year-old in the car model, or what's called the tertiary and inferior. These parts of ourselves are very important as well, starting with the co-pilot's leverage point, but there's a lot of information in there about how to become a more whole person. So grab a copy of the owner's manual.
Yeah. Thanks for being with us this week as we unpack this idea of one-sidedness from the main stage at Profiler Training. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we'll talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.